Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to take a really complex topic and unpack it using the source material you've shared with us specifically, some fascinating excerpts from a detailed chapter on schizophrenia.
It is a serious topic, a chronic disorder, as the sources highlight, affecting about, 1% of the world's population.
Yeah, around that figure. And the material is clear that it comes with significant human and economic costs.
Which really sets the stage for why this topic matters so much, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's also, one of the most misunderstood conditions out there.
For sure.
Your source dives right into that historical context, mentioning Eugen Bleuler coined the term schizophrenia, meaning split mind.
Right. But the sources are very quick to clarify something important there.
That this term does not mean split personality or multiple personalities.
Exactly. That's a key distinction the material makes right up front. Bleuler was referring more to a kind of split or, let's say, disruption within the mind's processes.
Okay. Like disorganized thinking and emotions, that sort of thing.
Yes, things that can cause a break from reality. It's definitely not about having multiple selves coexisting.
Got it. So, our goal with this deep dive, then, is to use these sources as our map, essentially. We're going to guide you through what they say about the symptoms you might see, explore the potential causes, looking at that mix of genetic and environmental factors the sources discuss.
And then we'll look at the changes observed in the brain and finally touch on the treatment approaches they describe.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Where do the sources suggest we start? With the symptoms.
Yes, let's start there. They lay out the symptoms pretty clearly, organizing them into three main categories: positive, negative, and cognitive symptoms.
Okay, positive, negative, cognitive. Let's unpack what the sources mean by positive first. They're described as excesses of normal function.
That's right. Think of them as things sort of added onto typical experience. These are often what people most readily associate with schizophrenia, actually.
Like hallucinations, for instance.
Exactly. Your material details hallucinations as perceptions that aren't based in reality. And it notes these are most commonly auditory stories, hearing voices.
Right. Hearing voices is the classic example.
But interestingly, the source points out they can also be visual. I think it's said around 70% of individuals experience those.
Wow, that high.
Yeah. And also olfactory, smell, tactile, touch, or even gustatory taste.
And the voices themselves, the source describes them as often having some kind of structure, not just random noise.
Yeah. They might talk directly to the person, or maybe hold conversations among themselves.
Or they could be threatening. Or maybe just meaningless chatter.
All of the above. According to the material, it sounds like a really vivid, often intrusive experience.
Okay, so hallucinations are one type of positive symptom. What else falls into this category according to the sources?
Delusions. These are described as fixed, false beliefs, not based in reality.
And crucially, resistant to reason, right? The source emphasizes that.
Absolutely. Resistant to reason or evidence. No matter how much you try to explain or show them otherwise, the person holds on to the belief.
The sources give some classic examples, don't they? Like delusions of persecution.
Yes, believing others are trying to harm them. Or delusions of grandeur, believing they have special powers or a unique, important identity.
And delusions of control, that idea that their thoughts or actions are being controlled by some outside force.
Exactly. The material really emphasizes just how strong and unshakable these beliefs can be for the individual.
Okay. So hallucinations, delusions. What's the third type of positive symptom mentioned?
Thought disorder. This is essentially disorganized, irrational thinking.
Right. This is where you might see speech patterns that jump unexpectedly between unrelated topics.
Yeah, or what they call loose associations, where one thought doesn't logically connect to the next.
Or even using words based on, how they rhyme rather than what they mean.
The source paints a picture of a kind of disrupted internal logic. It makes communication very difficult.
Okay, so those are the additions or excesses, the positive symptoms. Now, the sources also talk quite a bit about negative symptoms.
Yes, and these are described as deficits, or the absence of normal function, things that are missing or reduced.
And these are often less, maybe, dramatic from the outside, but the sources say they can be the most persistent and debilitating aspect.
That's often the case, yes. These include things like a flat emotional response, showing very little or no emotional expression.
Like a blunted affect.
Exactly. Also, poverty of speech, which isn't just being quiet necessarily, but a reduction in the amount or the meaningful content of speech.
Okay. And then there's avolition. That's a specific term the source uses.
Yes, avolition. The source describes it as a lack of initiative or persistence. It makes it incredibly difficult to start or complete activities, even basic ones.
So it's not laziness, it's a core symptom, that lack of drive or motivation.
Precisely. And also anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure.
So not just feeling unhappy, but like a fundamental lack of capacity for joy?
Yeah, in things that would normally be rewarding. And finally, social withdrawal is often listed as a negative symptom too. These deficits can really impact a person's ability to function day to day.
Which leads us nicely into the third category the sources discuss, cognitive symptoms.
Right. These are difficulties with mental processes, thinking, learning, memory, that sort of thing.
What specific issues do the sources list here?
Well, things like attention deficits, low psychomotor speed, which means slower physical and mental processing.
Okay.
Problems with learning new things and remembering them, difficulty with abstract thinking, and poor problem-solving skills.
And the sources emphasize that even though these might seem subtle compared to, say, hearing voices, they can significantly impair a person's ability to hold a job, maintain relationships, or just navigate daily life.
Absolutely. They can be incredibly disruptive in the long run.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty comprehensive picture of what schizophrenia looks like symptomatically based on your sources.
Yeah, covering those three key areas.
Now, let's use the material to explore that really complex question of why. Why might this develop?
Right. And the sources make it very clear it's not one single cause. It's a mix.
A mix of nature and nurture, basically. Genetics and environment.
That's exactly how the sources frame it. Schizophrenia clearly runs in families, which strongly suggests a genetic component.
But it's not simple, right? The sources stress it's not like inheriting eye color, not a single gene disorder.
No, definitely not. It's much more complex. And this is where your source brings in that really striking evidence from twin studies.
Ah, yes, the twin studies. Tell us what the material highlights there.
Well, the concordance rates, that's the chance that if one twin has it, the other one does too, are much higher for identical twins, monozygotic twins, than for fraternal or dizygotic twins.
Which makes sense because identical twins share all their genes, while fraternal twins only share about half, like regular siblings.
Exactly. So that strongly points to genes being involved. But the sources go a step further, highlighting a fascinating detail within the identical twin data.
Okay, what's that?
They differentiate between identical twins who shared a single placenta during pregnancy that's monochorionic and those who had separate placentas, dichorionic.
Okay, hang on. Monochorionic, sharing a placenta, dichorionic, separate placentas. Why does the source make that distinction? What's the significance?
This is the really interesting part. The concordance rate is significantly higher for those monochorionic twins, the ones sharing a placenta. The source mentions rates like 60% for them.
60%?
Compared to only about 10.7% for the dichorionic identical twins.
Even though both pairs are genetically identical.
Exactly. So your source uses this to argue that while genetics is clearly a huge factor, they shared prenatal environment, specifically sharing that placenta, and maybe blood supply seems to play a really important role too.
So it's not just the genes themselves, but maybe how those genes interact with the very, very earliest environment, right there in the womb.
That seems to be the implication drawn from the material, yes. It's a powerful detail connecting something like placental development to risk later in life.
That is fascinating. The material also mentions adoption studies, right? As further support for the genetic link.
Showing that children born to mothers with schizophrenia are still at higher risk, even if they're raised in a different healthy environment from birth.
And the sources also mention specific genes being looked at, like the DISC1 gene.
Yes, DIC1 is mentioned, and the sources note that certain rare mutations seem to be more common in people with schizophrenia, though it's complex, involving many genes likely contributing small effects.
And there was also something about paternal age.
Right. There's evidence linking increased age of the father to higher risk. The source speculates this could be due to accumulated mutations in sperm cells over a man's lifetime.
Okay, so genes definitely seem to kind of load the dice. But as you said, the sources emphasize that environment plays a role too, often by interacting with that genetic vulnerability.
Exactly. The environmental factors don't seem to act alone, but rather in concert with genetic predisposition.
So what do the sources tell us about these environmental factors? What kind of things are implicated?
Well, the material points to findings from large epidemiological studies looking at patterns in populations. There's a noted season of birth effect.
Ah, yes, I remember reading that. A higher incidence in people born in late winter or early spring.
That's the one. And the hypothesis presented in the source links this to potential prenatal exposure to infections, like influenza, especially during the second trimester of pregnancy.
When the brain is undergoing really rapid development.
Precisely. That seems to be a critical window.
Interesting. What other environmental links do the sources discuss?
Vitamin D deficiency is another association mentioned. Low levels, especially in newborns born in those winter-spring months, or people living in northern latitudes or dense urban areas.
Where sun exposure might be lower.
Right. That lower vitamin D level is linked in the material to increased risk.
And speaking of urban areas, the sources highlight that higher incidence in cities, don't they? Up to 3 times higher than rural areas.
Yes, that urbanicity effect is quite striking. The material suggests possible reasons, like maybe increased exposure to pathogens in denser populations, or perhaps the chronic stress associated with urban living.
Okay. And what about substance use? Are there links there?
Yes, the sources connect several substances. Smoking tobacco is mentioned, cannabis use, especially early and frequent use.
Right. The link with cannabis seems particularly studied.
It does.
Yeah.
And also the use of drugs like PCP and ketamine. These can either increase risk or, in some cases, temporarily mimic the symptoms of schizophrenia quite closely.
And finally, the sources bring up prenatal complications, right? Things going wrong during pregnancy or birth.
Obstetric complications like toxemia, preeclampsia, having a very low birth weight, or oxygen deprivation during delivery. These are all linked in the material to an increased risk later in life.
So if we try to connect all these environmental dots based on the sources,
Yeah.
they're not seen as standalone causes, but more like potential stressors or triggers that, especially in someone who's already genetically vulnerable.
Could potentially disrupt those crucial early brain development pathways. That seems to be the bigger picture drawn in the sources.
Which brings us nicely to what the sources actually say about the brain itself. What physical anomalies or neurochemical patterns does the material describe?
Well, starting with the physical side, the sources mention that minor physical anomalies, subtle variations in features like the face, limbs, or palms, are actually more common in individuals with schizophrenia.
Which, again, sort of hints at something potentially altering development very early on, doesn't it?
Exactly. It points towards early developmental processes. But the more consistent findings discussed are really in the brain structure itself.
Like the enlarged ventricles.
Yes. The sources consistently report enlarged cerebral ventricles, those fluid-filled spaces deep within the brain. That's a pretty common finding.
And also reduced gray matter.
The material presents evidence of reduced gray matter volume, particularly in areas like the frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, and the hippocampus.
Key areas for thinking, memory, and processing information.
Absolutely. And the sources note that this reduction appears, for some individuals at least, to progress over time. It's not just static.
Okay, so there are observable structural differences according to the sources. What about the chemical signaling, the neurotransmitters?
Right. The most well-known idea discussed in the material is the dopamine hypothesis.
The classic theory.
The original version, from decades ago, was basically that symptoms were caused by simply too much dopamine activity in the brain overall.
And the evidence for that came partly from how antipsychotic drugs work, right? They block dopamine receptors.
Exactly. And also the observation that drugs like amphetamines, which increase dopamine, can cause symptoms that look a lot like the positive symptoms of schizophrenia.
Makes sense. But the sources present a more refined understanding now, don't they? It's not just too much dopamine everywhere.
No, it's more nuanced. The current thinking, as presented in the sources, suggests that the positive symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, might be linked to hyperactivity, too much activity, specifically in what's called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway.
The mesolimbic pathway. Is that like a reward circuit in the brain?
Yeah, think of it as involved in reward, motivation, and determining what's salient or important in the environment. So overactivity there might make irrelevant things seem intensely significant, contributing to delusions or hallucinations.
Okay, so hyperactivity in that specific circuit linked to those excess positive symptoms. What about the negative and cognitive symptoms then? The deficits?
Well, the sources link those symptoms to potentially the opposite problem in a different area. Hypofrontality.
Hypofrontality, meaning too little activity.
Yes, decreased or reduced activity, specifically in the prefrontal cortex. That's the front part of the brain, crucial for planning, decision-making, working memory, complex thought.
So it's a tale of two pathways almost. Too much dopamine activity, perhaps, in the mesolimbic system driving positive symptoms, and too little activity in the prefrontal cortex contributing to negative and cognitive symptoms.
That's the more nuanced picture the sources paint, yes. It's not just dopamine levels globally, but the balance between different circuits.
And this hypofrontality, this reduced prefrontal activity, is it definitely a dopamine issue there too, or could other things be involved?
Good question. The sources suggest it could be related to problems with dopamine regulation in that specific prefrontal area, or it might involve problems with other neurotransmitter systems, like glutamate.
Ah, glutamate. You mentioned PCP and ketamine earlier mimicking symptoms.
Exactly. And the source brings those drugs up again here because they primarily act on glutamate receptors. The fact they can produce symptoms very similar to schizophrenia, including negative and cognitive ones, really implicates the glutamate system alongside dopamine.
That connection is really interesting. And the sources also discuss the newer atypical antipsychotics, like clozapine, suggesting they might work differently than the older ones.
Yes, they note that these atypical medications might affect dopamine activity in a more balanced way across different brain regions.
How so?
Well, the idea mentioned is that they might manage to increase dopamine activity slightly in the prefrontal cortex, potentially helping with negative cognitive symptoms,
while still decreasing the excess activity in the mesolimbic pathway that drives the positive symptoms.
Exactly. Or they might work through other mechanisms too, like affecting serotonin receptors, or having what the sources call partial dopamine agonism. It's complex, and the sources clarify this is still an active area of research, figuring out precisely how they work best.
And it loops back again to genetics, doesn't it? That DIC1 gene we mentioned earlier. The source suggests that genetic factor might be involved in disrupting both brain development and these complex dopamine and possibly glutamate systems.
It really seems to be all interconnected, according to the material. A complex interplay of genes, environment, brain development, and neurochemistry.
It certainly sounds that way.
Yeah.
Okay, finally, let's just briefly touch on what the sources mention about treatment approaches.
Sure. The sources state pretty clearly that the primary treatment involves antipsychotic medications.
Right. And as we discussed, the older typical antipsychotics primarily target those positive symptoms, largely by blocking dopamine D2 receptors.
Yes. And the material also highlights the development of those atypical antipsychotics we just mentioned,
which, as the sources describe, might have different mechanisms like that partial dopamine agonism or effects on other neurotransmitters.
Potentially offering benefits for a wider range of symptoms, maybe including some of the negative and cognitive ones, though results can vary a lot between individuals.
Okay. So this deep dive, really guided by your source material, has taken us quite a journey from understanding the varied symptoms you might observe.
Positive, negative, and cognitive.
Through that intricate mix of genetic predispositions and environmental factors that might be at play.
The nature and nurture interaction.
And into the complex neurobiological changes described in the brain, the structure, the dopamine hypothesis, the glutamate links.
It really underscores just how complex schizophrenia is, doesn't it? And how much ongoing research is still needed to fully unravel it, based on the picture presented in these sources.
Absolutely. Okay, so having explored what these sources say about the strong biological underpinnings of schizophrenia, the genetics, the subtle brain changes, the neurochemistry, and considering the significant impact this condition clearly has, here's something for you, our listener, to ponder. What does this scientific understanding, as laid out in the material we've discussed, imply about how society should view and support individuals living with this disorder?
Yeah, what are the implications, perhaps, for stigma, or for the allocation of resources, or just for basic human understanding?
That's a question worth considering based on the information you've provided today.